So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this evening. It's fantastic that I can see that the numbers are going up and up, and there's over 175 people on this webinar at the moment, which is absolutely fantastic. So we're really pleased to be able to welcome you to this webinar this evening and to be able to give you a flavour of the research that we're conducting at Durham University on the topic of autism. Just to give you a very brief welcome, I'm Debbie Ryby. I'm a Professor of Developmental Psychology and Director of the Centre for Developmental Disorders. We thought this would be a great opportunity to be able to give you an insight in the type of research that we're conducting at Durham University on the topic of autism. Well aware that this week is Autism Awareness Week or Autism Acceptance Week or just Autism Week, whichever is your preferred way of expressing that this week is an opportunity for us to think about autism and autistic individuals within our community. We wanted to take this opportunity to be able to talk to a really wide audience, a really wide community of people about the research that we are conducting. And there really is a wide audience on this call. It's fantastic to have such a broad and diverse audience interested in hearing about the research that we're conducting. We are well aware that there are many individuals from the autistic community, there are many family members, there are teachers, educational psychologists, and all sorts of people who are on this call today to be able to hear about the different types of projects that we're conducting. And we're hugely grateful for this opportunity to be able to engage with such a broad and diverse audience. So thank you for showing an interest in attending this event this evening. One of the very, very small bonuses of a time of pandemic and COVID is that we're able to hold events like this and have an audience that comes from a very wide geographical dispersion, so that we can enable us to get our word out about our research as much as possible. And that's what we're trying to do this evening. So who are we? Who's going to be talking to you this evening? Well, we're all members of the Department of Psychology at Durham University and members of the Centre for Developmental Disorders Research. You're going to hear this evening research from 4 of our PhD students, 1 of our postdoctoral research fellows, and our academic researchers as well. And we're really pleased to be able to give you an insight into some of the types of research projects that we're conducting on autism this evening across a really wide variety of different types of projects. We're going to cover 3 broad themes of our research this evening. Now, this isn't all the research that we conduct within our research group. We're conducting research on a diversity of issues. For example, projects on looking at how to evaluate memory using non-verbal measures that are suitable for individuals with autism and those with learning disabilities as well. And looking at intervention and support for children with challenging, repetitive and restrictive behaviours in collaboration with other universities in the UK. But this evening, we're going to tell you about 3 core areas of the research that we're conducting in our group. We're going to begin by telling you about research we're conducting on sensory processing, or the autistic sensory world, and thinking about also links to learning and sensory issues. We're again going to move on to hear about some projects focusing on the autistic social world and the importance of social interactions, before finishing with our final theme, which is on females with autism. We're going to just give you a snippet of information about each project so that we have the opportunity to tell you about as many of the different studies as possible. So no more than 10 to 15 minutes for each of these different project areas. Through the selection of studies that we're going to tell you about this evening, you'll be able to see some illustrations of our work in co-producing research and impact with other partners, such as the autistic community, teachers, educational psychologists, for example. We're going to show you illustrations of how our research touches on both theories of autism, the psychological theories, and how we are translating that towards practice and making it an impact crucially for the autistic community, and how we work with non-academic collaborators and partners in the research that we conduct. Of course, none of the research that we are conducting would be possible without the many people that we work with in our studies. So some of these projects that you'll hear about today are from collaborative research partnerships with non-academic partners. For example, Durham County Council, the North East Autism Society and the Williams Syndrome Foundation, which are two core charities, and with schools such as the Croft Community School. And we wouldn't be able to conduct any of this without our funding from our funders. And the types of projects that we're going to talk to you about today are funded by a range of different funding organisations. But most importantly, we wouldn't be able to conduct the research that we're going to tell you about without our research community, without the autistic individuals who have given up their time to be able to help with the research and who we're hoping to work with again in the future in a number of these projects. Without families, without siblings and parents, without the schools and numerous schools and teachers and educational psychologists involved, and many others who are really integral to the research that we conduct in this area. So we're hugely grateful for all of these different partnerships that enable us to conduct the research that we're going to tell you about this evening. Before we start, just a couple of pieces of kind of housekeeping information, really. You will see that there's a Q&A, question and answer tab that you're able to use on this webinar. If you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to type those questions into the Q&A tab. We may have an opportunity as we get between different studies, depending on how timing is going, to be able to pick up a few of these questions as we go along. Can't promise that we're going to get through all of them, but we will try and pick up a question here or there if we have time within the schedule this evening to pick up some of those questions. We are recording this session, as you may have noticed, and we're hoping to be able to make that recording available on the web, linked to the Centre for Developmental Disorders and Durham University. And I know a few people have already contacted us today to say that they would like access to that recording, and we'll be organising that over the next week or so after the Easter break. All of the researchers presenting this evening have their email addresses on their presentations, on their slides. So if you are really interested in a specific project and you want to find out more, or you want to volunteer to be involved in any way in the future, please feel free to email any of the presenters during the session or after the session this evening, using those contact details that you'll find throughout the webinar tonight. So thank you very much for listening to my introduction. It gives me great pleasure to begin the first of tonight's theme of presentations. And first of all, we're going to be thinking about the sensory world and the autistic sensory world and links to learning. With the first presentation just being loaded up by Liz Jones, who is a PhD student within our group and has been conducting research on this aspect of autism for the last few years. So I shall hand over to Liz to be able to talk to you about the first talk today.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Jones, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my PhD work, which has really looked at if and how sensory processing differences have affected learning and school life for autistic pupils. I just want to say from the outset, I've really enjoyed this work, met some really great children, some really inspiring teachers, and so I'm really grateful for everyone that has made this possible. So what I'm going to do this evening is just introduce you to two studies that we've done, but that I've done a lot more, and I'm happy to go into any further detail on that. Right, so to begin, what do we mean by sensory processing? So in short, sensory processing is the neurobiological process of how we use what we sense to make sense of the world. Now we've got what I refer to as the classic 5 senses. So we've got looking, tasting, smelling, hearing and touching. We've also got these other 3 down here, which you might not have heard of, which is the vestibular, which refers to movement, proprioception, which is muscle and joint sensation. So this might be thinking about how tight you need to grip things. And then interoception, which refers to internal organ sensation. So sensory processing refers to the mechanism by which the central nervous system receives input from all these senses and integrates this information to generate an appropriate behavioural response. Now we know 60 to 90% of autistic individuals experience sensory differences, and there are a couple of ways we can conceptualise or think about these differences, but one common approach has been to think about them in terms of hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. So hypersensitivity is really thinking there's too much stimulation, whereas hyposensitivity hypersensitivity is sort of the opposite of that. So it might mean that you miss input. So in the classroom, hypersensitivity might be presented as getting distressed by lots of noises in the classroom or being adverse to bright lights. Conversely, hyposensitivity, that might mean that a child misses sensory input. So for example, not noticing a teacher calling their name. Now, what's really important is that autistic individuals experience both hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. So you see both patterns, and this can vary across these different modalities. So you might have hypersensitivity in the auditory domain, but be hyposensitivity in terms of like olfactory domain. So all this together means that we've got really a lot of variability in the sensory differences that we see. So what does this all mean for the classroom, and why is that important? Well, I think although the Autism Act and the Children and Families Act really improved educational outcomes for autistic pupils, it's still the case that many autistic children continue to underachieve academically and experience high rates of exclusion. In addition, in 2017, an all-party parliamentary report that 50% of autistic individuals reported being unhappy at school and did not feel as though their needs were being met. Now, although several of these difficulties did relate to their social issues at school, it was the case that many pupils highlighted that sensory differences could be as detrimental to their classroom experience. Yet despite this, we don't really know how these sensory differences impact educational outcomes, and that was really a key goal of the PhD thesis. Now, I just really want to emphasise here that sensory differences are not always adverse, and actually many autistic individuals who explain that these differences can bring joy depending on the context. So throughout my thesis, I adopted the Nordic relational model of disability to try and understand the circumstances in which sensory differences bring joy to autistic individuals and the circumstances where they might not be so pleasant. So within this model, disability occurs when there is a mismatch between an individual's needs and the environment in which they're placed. So thinking about that in the classroom, a child with hypersensitivity might experience disability when there's lots of bright noises, lots of children, but they might not experience disability or have those negative experiences when they're in the quiet of home and they have control of that environment. But because we know, particularly in primary school, that autistic children, well, all people spend the majority of the school day in the same classroom, a mismatch here between the child's sensory preferences and needs and the environment in which they're placed could be actually quite adverse. So that's really what we're trying to explore throughout this PhD work. So the first study I'm going to talk to you about is really asking parents and teachers for their insights on sort of the nature of sensory differences at school, impacts on learning, and thinking about what we could do to sort of minimise those effects. So to understand this, we developed 2 questionnaires, one for parents and one for teachers. And these questionnaires contained both open questions and closed questions and asked about type of differences, impacts and factors that influenced how frequently these differences impacted behaviour. So we shared these questionnaires through Senko networks, through schools and through social media. And we had 57 mums and 70 teachers take part. And importantly, these were from a range of school provisions, so special schools, mainstream schools. So we really had quite a diverse mix of people taking part in the questionnaire. So for the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail about the questionnaire, but I can put a link to the published paper if you'd like to have a look at that in a little bit more detail in your own time. But for now, I'll just concentrate on the responses that we got when we asked parents and teachers how sensory differences affect learning. So a key theme that emerged was that sensory differences could cause lots of distraction in the classroom. So a teacher from mainstream school wrote, "They struggle to tune out the noises they don't need, affecting their ability to listen to instructions and input." Anxiety was also another really common theme, with one parent from mainstream school writing, "She either appears anxious or angry. How can you possibly learn with all that adrenaline rushing through you? It's like asking someone to do long division when they're free falling from a plane. It's not going to happen." Distress was also, explained by lots of parents and teachers. So a parent from, I think this was a special school, wrote, "Corridors, open halls where sounds can be echoed. My child will self-harm and try to cover his ears." Sensory differences could also impact classroom participation, and this ranged from engagement with tasks to be able to enter the classroom or even being able to attend school at all. So one parent wrote, "He begs us to homeschool him. He misses a lot of lessons, often just getting the worksheet, then withdrawing from class to work elsewhere. However, some teachers explained that they could use sensory differences as a tool for learning. So a teacher from mainstream school wrote, having visual stimuli should allow students to associate pictures or that visual stimuli to certain topics or a way of remembering the subject." So I think really a key message from this study is that parents and teachers believe that sensory differences frequently impact learning and school life. And they did this by by causing distraction, anxiety, distress, and also limiting participation. So I didn't mention it in this slide, but we also asked sort of the factors that can minimise disruption to learning, and from this, increasing predictability, creating low simulation classroom designs, and access to occupational therapy tools were really helpful, alongside staff knowledge to sort of think about how we can work with these children to reduce the impact of sensory processing differences. However, there was a sense amongst parents and teachers that these factors, especially access to occupational therapy tools, were much easier in special schools compared to mainstream schools. And I think thinking about that difference between provisions is really important when we think about the context in which these sensory differences are taking place. So what I'm going to do now is sort of shift the focus from the child to actually thinking about the classroom environment and how those two interact together. So what I'm going to do is show you this. So what we did to understand the impact of the classroom environment is we built a pop-up classroom where we could manipulate the audio and visual stimuli. So this is really a stripped back version of what you see. But as you can imagine, the classroom contains a multitude of different stimuli, so posters on the wall, lots of sounds. We were trying to really strip it back but recreate that as much as we could. So the aim of this study was to see how audio and visual input impacted the ability for a child to stay on task in the classroom. So what we did, we had 4 conditions. So we had a baseline condition. So these curtains were flipped around and there was no pictures on it. So they were bare. And the child was asked to complete a reading task in silence. We also had an audio condition. So there was no visual displays. The curtains were bare. But we had classroom sounds played from a little speaker hidden at the bottom there. So this was sounds of furniture moving, children babbling, everyday classroom sounds. We then had a visual condition, which is what you can see here. So we had all these different visual displays, but no classroom sounds. And then the audio-visual condition, where we pulled all this together, where we had the posters and classroom sounds. Now we asked the children to complete a reading task independently for 8 minutes in each of these conditions, but we swapped the conditions around, counterbalance them, so we didn't have order effects. Now, although we encouraged the child to complete the task independently, I was just sat outside so they could ask for help if they needed to. So we're really interested in the behaviours that children were showing in these different environments. So what we did is we video recorded the child in each condition and then looked at their behaviours afterwards. So we had 3 sort of broad behaviours, which were on task, off task, and supported engagement. So a child was deemed to be on task if their eye gaze indicated that they were either looking at the task and they were engaging with the research materials, the task materials. Supported engagement refers to when the child is on task, but the experimenter is helping them either because they've asked for help or they've been off task for a prolonged period and the experimenter is getting them back on task. Then we had off-task behaviours. So that's really where the child's not working independently and they're not working with the experimenter to go through the work. So we're really interested in the types of off-task behaviours that children were showing. So we had environmental distraction. So that's where the child is perhaps looking at the posters on the wall or asking about the classroom sounds. We then had self-distraction. So that's where the child might be playing with their jumper or playing with their shoelaces. We had motor gross behaviour. So that's where the child might be out of their seat, touching the curtains or playing with the table. Had motor fine. So that's where the child's playing with their pen or smaller movements like this. Then we had experimental distraction. So that's where the child's talking to the experimenter about something that's really not relevant to the task at all, because it's quite random. So that might seem a little bit abstract in a minute, but what I'm going to do is show you some videos so you can to illustrate these different types of behaviours. So just to mention that we have got consent to share these videos, but please don't take any pictures or share them more widely. So this is an example of on-task behaviour, so where the child is sat doing the work perfectly fine. So we will perhaps have an opportunity to share those videos at the end, and I think that's probably quite good because they really illustrate the off-task behaviour really quite well. But what we found is that autistic children spent significantly more time off-task compared to neurotypical children. But both groups spent significantly more time off-task in the visual and audiovisual condition compared to audio and baseline. So those are the conditions where we had those posters on the wall. And when children were off-task, that was mainly due to environmental distraction in those conditions, so much so that environmental distraction was greater in the visual and audiovisual condition compared to baseline and audio. So thinking about what this means, it means that the classroom sensory environment can impact the ability to stay on task. And because autistic and neurotypical children were shown off-task behaviours, that means adapting the classroom can benefit all children, not just those with sensory processing disorder or autistic children with these sensory differences. In particular, reducing the amount of visual displays can be really beneficial. Now, I'm not saying here strip all visual displays because they are really important in terms of presenting children's work and for self-esteem, but I think perhaps reducing them might be a good step forward, and obviously we need to strike the balance between the two. Thinking really about what both of these studies mean and the thesis more broadly, I think we really realised that we need to hear multiple perspectives and use different techniques to try and understand how these sensory differences impact learning. And I haven't presented it here, but we did also ask autistic females about their experiences at school. So really, capturing the autistic voice and hearing their experiences is really important. I think also it's definitely not one size fits all. We need to think about the match between the environment and the child's specific needs. And that's really important here because there's so much variability in the sensory differences that we see. There's lots of good practice already out there. I've seen it firsthand in schools, but I think working together, there's probably lots of little changes we could put in place to make things easier. One example would perhaps be reducing the amount of displays in the classroom. I'm thinking about how we can increase child agency. So that's all from me. I'll try and get these videos up so I can show you perhaps later on in the webinar, but thank you everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Sorry, I was having technical issues there. It wouldn't allow me to unmute or anything. It wouldn't allow me to move the mouse for some reason. Sorry about that. So thank you very much for your presentation. Do you want us to see if we can play one of those videos now, just as an illustration?
Yeah, if you can.
I've got them here. Which one would you like? On task, gross motor, or environment?
I think the one with the girl, I think, is a good one.
I can't tell which is which. Do you know what the title is?
In the environment, I think.
And we had a good question in the Q&A just about how people can contact us about any other projects. I think the best way to contact us would be via myself or Debbie, and then we can forward you on to who it is that you might want to speak to. And our contact details are on the slides, and we will be sending a recording to everybody, and so the contact details will all be on there.
Sorry, Liz, I can't get those videos to play.
It's okay, I'll have a go and try and get that up and running.
Okay, we'll move on to the next presentation and see how we get on. So next up this evening we have Aloka, who is going to talk to us about her research, which is also on the autistic sensory world, and it is taking a slightly different perspective as to how we study sensory issues and sensory reactivity especially. And this is a new project, and this is work that is going to be planned for being conducted over the next year or so, rather than completed research as Liz was presented in her presentation. So Aloka, if you want to share your screen.
Share my slides.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, you can see it.
Okay. So hello everyone, good evening. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you Debbie for giving such a nice introduction to my study. So following up from Liz's study on understanding the sensory world of autism, today I will be talking about a new planned study that we are going to begin work on in the next couple of months, is understanding how to measure the sensory world of autism. So I'm working with Dr. Mary Henley and Professor Deborah Ribby, and my postdoctoral fellowship is funded by the Daphne Jackson Trust. So just giving you a brief outline about sensory processing, and which will be the basis of why we are carrying out my study. And following from that, I will explain to you what we plan to do in our study and how will we go about collecting data. So what do we know all about sensory processing in autism? We know that, as Liz has already mentioned, that nearly 95% children with autism, they show sensory processing challenges. So it's an extremely common, challenging difficulty that individuals on the spectrum face. And although understanding of sensory processing is at its infancy, and this is mainly one of the reasons might be because it was included only as a diagnostic criteria to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual as late as 2013, and can give rise to a number of challenging behaviors, which Liz has already touched upon in her study, such as anxiety or withdrawal symptoms, or behaviors such as avoidance. And this can really have a significant impact on the daily life activities, as well as Liz has said, in the educational activities. So just looking at, what sensory processing difficulties are, also known as sensory atypicalities. So there are examples of where people don't like being touched or hugged or kissed even by a family member. They are startled or even frightened by loud sounds or even normal sounds or even bright lights. And some people are even sensitive to background noises, which even some of us might not be able to hear. Also, some people feel very worried about, maybe standing close to someone else or being bumped when they're standing in a queue or being touched by other kids. Some people even refuse to wear even scratchy or tight or even other uncomfortable kind of clothes. So from all these examples, we come to my next slide, which looks at, there's a lot of sensory experiences are very hard to measure. So that's one of the main problems. As we've seen in the previous slide, there's lots of individual differences in sensory processing. So from which sensory domains or sense organs are affected, some people's, sound is affected where they may be very hypersensitive or show increased sensitive to normal sounds, or some people may be oversensitive to certain kinds of smell. For example, smell of, like that comes from normal cooking. Some people might be sensitive to certain textures of food, such as, mushy food. So they may show increased sensitivity. They may also reduce sensitivity, for example, diminish sensitivity to pain. And also sensory processing differences, as I've mentioned already, it leads to a number of challenging behaviors. For example, they might show clinical levels of anxiety, or they may avoid people, or which may lead to them withdrawing into themselves. Some individuals also who are diagnosed with autism, they also may have other co-occurring conditions, for example, ADHD, and that is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And ADHD is one of the most common co-occurring conditions that occurs with individuals who have autism. So all these kinds of differences and all these kinds of difficulties that are there in the sensory experiences leads us to the next question, is how can we measure sensory processing in autism? So sensory processing difficulties are usually measured by a number of different ways. One of them is either qualitatively, by carrying out interviews with parents or caregivers of individuals who are on the spectrum, or directly with individuals who are on the spectrum, or by administering standardized behavioral measures or questionnaire measures. And another kind of studies that can be carried out is, looking at brain studies, for example, fMRI or EEG. And the third one, which is important to my study, is looking at physiological body responses. That is, other than the way when the body reacts, how it reacts to all the incoming information. I mean, the changes that happen in the body. For example, is there an increase in heart rate, or is there a decrease in heart rate, or is there any kind of changes in the amount of sweating, whether they start sweating more? So what does my study want to look at? So basically in our study, we want to look at whether these body responses or physiological responses, do they predict, are they a better predictor of, challenging behaviors such as anxiety or avoidance as compared to traditional parent report measures? Also, we want in our study, we want to look at ADHD as a co-occurring condition in autism. And what does ADHD, or individuals who have ADHD, does it add anything else? Does it add to their sensory processing difficulties across to these individuals who are on the spectrum? Also, can we, by studying these body responses or physiological responses, can we actually, subtype them or, put them in clusters of sensory profiles? So from here, we go to my main study, or how we are going to plan to carry out a study, and we'll talk about the participants who will be participating in our study. So we are hoping that we'll be able to recruit children who are between the ages of 6 to 11 years of age, and we will be having 3 groups of children. So children with autism, children who have autism along with ADHD, and also children who do not have any autism or ADHD. So the way we will be going about collecting data for our study is we will be approaching parents or caregivers, and only after their permission and consent, we will provide them with detailed information about what our study is all about. And we will ask them to fill up a detailed, certain behavioral standard questionnaire measures. Some of them we will administer on the phone, and some of them we will send by post. We will also invite parents and caregivers to come along with their children to the lab at Durham University, where we will be administering the IQ test. And also we will be also administering a very fun experiment where we will be presenting them with different kinds of sensory stimuli. For example, some images. For example, it might be a flashing checkerboard, or certain sounds like the sound of a fire engine alarm. And we will, while the children is listening to these things or seeing these images, we will be recording how their body reacts by attaching really just some non-invasive just electrodes on their fingers, which will record changes in their skin conductors and heart rate variability. So coming to my main last slide is, why is this work important? So it would not only add to the understanding of the sensory world of autism, also lead to understanding of the underlying mechanisms of sensory processing difficulties. Also, this study is also an example. It shows how we can use a multi-method approach, to how to study sensory processing difficulties in individual, and how different people with different diagnoses, whether it's with autism or autism with ADHD or with no diagnosis, how they respond to the sensory information. Also, as Liz mentioned in a study, that sensory processing difficulties, we might not always view it as an adverse condition, but there are certain potential positives that are associated with it, and we can also look at that. And also we can look at the role of anxiety, a challenging behavior that is really that arises from these kinds of sensory processing difficulties, and how is it related to these difficulties. We also would it's important to know whether co-occurring conditions or another condition that occurs with autism, such as ADHD, having this condition or having symptoms of this condition, does it add to or increase their sensitivity or decrease their sensitivity? Does it add something like a sensory marker or a sensory signature to their sensory processing difficulties? And of course, last but not the least, it's really important, as Liz also mentioned, that to understand sensory processing is very important, because it would really help, most importantly, to develop support strategies or aids for individuals on the spectrum, and also targeted interventions for individuals with autism. So thank you very much. If you would like to know more about a study, you can contact me out here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Anoka. AAA, attention, arousal, and anxiety. Now, by impact project, what I mean is that we're not going to be doing any new research in this project. Instead, we're going to be developing ways to use the research that we have to translate it from research to practice. So to translate it from academic papers, for example, into an accessible and practical form that can be used by people for whom it's most relevant. So part of this team in Durham University is myself, is Debbie Ryby, Emily McDougall, who's now at Surrey, Jessica Hurst, and Rosie Johnson, who work as RAs, research assistants on this project. But I'm really excited that on this project, we're working with the communication and interaction team from Durham County Council. They're our collaborative partners on this project, led by Dr. Janet Crawford. And really, we're going to be harnessing their expertise while we try to translate this research to practice over the next 9 months. So I'm going to begin by explaining a little bit about what we mean when we say AAA issues and why they're important in the classroom. And I'm aware that some of this has been touched on already. So just briefly, the classroom is a very busy multisensory environment, and there's lots of things that children have to filter out and ignore in order to pay attention and learn. For some children, this is much more difficult than for others, especially children who have difficulties with attention, arousal, or anxiety. Having difficulties with attention means it's really hard to stay on task, especially when there are other things to capture attention. Having arousal or sensory processing difficulties, as you've heard from Liz and Aloka, it makes everyday sensory inputs can be very distressing, they can be hyper-arousing, or indeed they can be not noticed or link into hypoarousal. Having anxiety means the world feels like a very unpredictable place. That can be very distressing, and it can make it really difficult to focus on anything except the thing that is causing anxiety, except the anxiety itself. Some children have some of these difficulties, some children have none. They're very common for autistic children, and indeed autistic children tend to experience all three together. But they're also relevant for many children, especially children with other developmental conditions. What we want to do over the course of the next 9 months is translate the research evidence that we have on AAA issues. And we really want to raise awareness and understanding, particularly with educational professionals. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. And the ultimate aim is that by raising awareness and understanding with educators, we begin to be able to enhance learning outcomes for a range of children. So just briefly giving an overview of the work that we've done, we've tried to understand AAA issues in different ways and using different methods. So some of this work, as you've seen from Liz, involves questionnaires. Some of it involves interviews, and this is with autistic adults, parents, teachers. Some of the work involves experiments with autistic and non-autistic children where we've manipulated sensory features of a classroom and looked at how this impacts upon attention and behaviour and learning. A lot of this work has focused on autistic and non-autistic children, but in some of our work we've tried to take what we call a neurodiverse approach. So not looking at these diagnostic categories and just looking at a range of children with different profiles. And in this example we were looking at attention and maths achievement. What I'm going to do now is give you a really brief snippet of some of those study examples, and then explain how we want to emphasize how these things link together. And what we're going to do with this information and with this evidence is develop an online resource that will be freely accessible to all based on some of these study examples. So just thinking about attention to begin with. When you think about learning in the classroom, there are lots of cognitive or thinking skills that are really important, but attention is one of them. Attention is a significant one. And that's because it acts as a gateway to learning. You know, to learn about something, you must first be able to pay attention to it. And we know from a range of research that autistic people can show attentional differences, for example, superior attention to detail. So in this particular study, we were interested in attention in autistic and non-autistic children, but specifically how they use their attention abilities to pay attention and learn during a classroom task. Now, crucially, we were interested in whether features of a classroom like classroom displays can have an impact on attention and learning. In this study, we made a series of video lessons to look at this. And we asked two groups of children, an autistic group and a group of children who were non-autistic, to watch these videos and answer questions to test their learning at the end. We used specialist equipment called eye tracking equipment. And eye tracking equipment allowed us to measure very accurately and precisely what children were looking at, what they were paying attention to when they were watching these lessons. Crucially, half of the video lessons had nothing in the background, And half of the video lessons had busy and colourful classroom displays. And these displays that we used were actually taken from a primary school classroom. And we wanted to know if the presence of displays would have an effect on attention and learning. And in this bar chart, what you can see is the amount of time children in each group spent looking at the background, dependent on whether there were displays or not. And what we found was that when there were displays, children spent much more time looking at them than the teacher, and children with autism did this to a much greater extent. And you might say, well, it's not very surprising that if you give children more things to look at, they'll spend more time looking at them. But what we found was that looking at displays mattered, because learning scores were not as good when displays were present compared to when they were absent. And the amount of time children spent looking at displays was a strong predictor of how much they remembered over and above their cognitive ability, for example. In other words, classroom displays can be distracting, especially for autistic children. Now you might say, well, what does a study of looking at video lessons tell us about learning in the classroom? You've already heard from Liz in more detail that actually we did do a very similar study in a real life scenario. We made a pop-up classroom, and hopefully you can see my little video playing there. And we found a very similar pattern. So visual displays led to much more off-task behaviour than other types of sensory input. And so what this tells us is that sensory features of the classroom are important because they can impact attention, they can impact learning, they can do this for all children, but especially for autistic children. And as Liz said before, you know, the interesting thing about displays, I suppose, is that it's possible to change these in such a way that may benefit all children. So moving on to just focus on sensory issues. We've heard from both Liz and Aloka about what we mean when we say arousal or sensory issues, and about what types of sensory differences autistic people experience. And while our understanding of sensory differences in autism is certainly getting better in some respects, we still have relatively little evidence about how it impacts upon learning and education. And Liz gave you a good insight into one of her studies on sensory differences and impact in school with parents and teachers. And this study really emphasised just how much of a difficulty that sensory differences can give rise to for many autistic children. So in Liz's study, 71% of teachers and 81% of parents reported that sensory differences impacted learning frequently or all of the time. And Liz gave some really good illustrations of how parents and teachers explained how sensory issues impacted through distraction and distress, for example. And it's important to emphasize that autistic adults say very similar things, thinking about their own experiences and reflecting back on their own experiences in school. So in this example, I would have panic attacks at secondary school in assemblies, there were too many people and it got too noisy and overwhelming. So emphasizing the sensory input and how that linked to the anxiety. Really important to note that autistic adults, parents and teachers gave us these really interesting examples, but there was a real range and a real diversity of experiences. And so even though this work highlights the importance of sensory differences leading to some difficulties at school, there's no one profile and there's no one impact. However, anxiety was a very common theme to have emerged from parents, from teachers and from autistic adults. And just thinking about anxiety, we have good evidence now that explains the role of sensory differences in developing anxiety, particularly for autistic people. How sensory differences can make the world feel like a very unpredictable place, and how that can contribute to developing anxiety. And we know that anxiety is a very common and often very difficult problem for a lot of autistic people. And that really links to the final study example that I want to share. And this was aimed at understanding barriers and facilitators of learning in the classroom for children with autism. And it was a study led by Emily McDougall. And Emily interviewed teachers from a range of different educational provisions about these barriers and facilitators to learning. Now, unsurprisingly, teachers explained a range of different barriers and a range of different facilitators, like, for example, access to resources. And Liz mentioned some of the occupational tools in her talk. When you have them, they can make a huge difference, and when you don't have them, they can act as a significant barrier. But of all the things teachers shared, one of the most prevalent and significant was anxiety acting as a barrier for children to be able to focus and pay attention and learn in the classroom linked to sensory issues. And teachers really spoke about needing a resource and a toolkit that they could use to help them understand anxiety, and also something for them to draw upon to have a range of strategies at their fingertips to be able to use with a whole range of children. And that brings us to the point that we're at now. We want to use the examples that we have to raise awareness and to raise understanding of these AAA issues, how they impact learning in the classroom for a lot of children, but especially for autistic children. And I think one of the main points we want to emphasize is how these issues interact together and how they link together. Particularly because these are internal states, you know, anxiety, sensory issues, they're not things that we can easily or immediately see or observe. And so we really need the understanding to be there. And so we want to use this information to get educators in particular to think about the children they're supporting and ask themselves, could this be a AAA issue, and what can I do about it? I think it's really important to emphasize that we're not suggesting these are the only things that are important or the only things we need to consider. And as an example, in Emily's interview paper, teachers talked about a lot of different barriers for learning for autistic children. But these are things we are doing further research on. These are things we have ongoing research at the moment. But for what we do have already, we want to translate this into an online resource. It's going to be targeted at educators, and by educators, I mean trainee teachers, SENCOs, school leaders, teaching assistants, educational psychologists, a whole range of educational professionals. But equally, we want it to be suitable for anybody who's interested in AAA issues and for anybody who might benefit from the information. Importantly, it's going to be freely accessible to anybody who wishes to use it. And most importantly, it will be co-produced with autistic people, with parents, and with teachers. That's a really quick overview of the work and what we plan to do with it. If anybody's interested in contributing to the development of the resource, hearing more about the project and the updates, please do get in touch. Our email addresses are here on the slides, and you'll get those via the recording. And we also have a website dedicated to the project, which again, you'll get access to via the recording. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Mary. I'm back without technical issues, I hope, this time. So thank you very much to our first three presenters, all under the theme of sensory processing and links to learning as well. And I hope it's clear to show how we're using research to move towards that transition to translating the research into practice and making an impact for the autistic community as well. We're going to move on to the second theme of this evening, and that is the autistic social world. So social issues and social experiences are obviously really important when we think about autism. And we're going to give you an insight into some of the issues that we've been looking at in terms of social functioning, social processing, the social world of individuals who have autism. And the first speaker is Ellen Ridley. So Ellen, do you want to go ahead and share your screen, if you can?
Just click a few buttons, and Debbie, if you could let me know if that's clear.
That's perfect, yep.
Good. Okay, so hi everybody, I'm Ellen Ridley. I'm really pleased to be able to tell you about my work within the centre, which focuses on understanding social vulnerabilities in neurodivergent children. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try and give you an overview of what I mean by social vulnerability, why I think it's a really important area of research, and some of the types of questions that I'm trying to answer in my PhD. I'm funded by a doctoral fellowship by the Baillie Thomas Charitable Fund. And I want to start by saying my talk's going to be a little bit different because my research focuses not only on autistic children, but also children with a range of other neurodevelopmental conditions. And you'll see that I've put the Williams Syndrome Foundation logo on my slide. And that's because Williams Syndrome is one of the key groups that I work with. And as a result, I work really closely with the Williams Syndrome Foundation. So I've said that I'm looking at social vulnerability, and you might be wondering what I mean by that. Vulnerability is a really broad term. There's many different reasons why a person or a group might be considered vulnerable, and as such that term is used in numerous ways. There's a few formal definitions that we see in the academic literature, but to summarise, social vulnerability is specific to interpersonal interactions. So getting on in the social world requires the ability to identify situations where involvement may lead to negative outcomes, such as being deceived, being misled, or being cheated in some way. And someone who is socially vulnerable might find it difficult to detect and to avoid those sorts of situations. And that might lead to adverse interpersonal experiences such as victimization, bullying, those sorts of things. Importantly, social vulnerability is influenced by both the environment and by a range of person factors. And those factors can be physical, cognitive, social, and sort of individual motivations as well. So I guess what I mean by this is, in a potentially challenging or manipulative situation, it's the interaction between both the situation and these person factors that can either promote a negative outcome or safeguard against one. And social vulnerability has been emphasised across many different clinical groups, including older people, people with dementia, people with schizophrenia, and people who have intellectual and developmental diagnoses. Why do I think social vulnerability is important in the context of neurodivergent people? Well, social interactions are inherently complicated and dynamic, and I think we actually take for granted the huge range of skills that are required to navigate our everyday interactions. So it requires us to attend to social information, attend at the right time and then disengage. It involves us being able to decipher social cues. So things like making face evaluations, making trust evaluations, being able to detect deceit and respond to others appropriately. And importantly, we all naturally vary in our social abilities and difficulties and our preferences for how we want to interact with others. But in many neurodivergent groups, elements of social expertise may develop differently, and that might impact on the flow and the success of an interaction, which has wider implications when we think about vulnerable outcomes. And it's really important because all of these things have a huge real-world impact. So, for example, a study found that neurodiverse children were 3.4 times more likely to experience social adversity than their neurotypical peers. And being even more specific, think about autism specifically, we see high levels of social isolation and victimization in autistic children. So I mentioned Williams syndrome at the very start, and I'm actually going to use Williams syndrome as an example of a neurodevelopmental condition that has real relevance when we think about social vulnerability. So over the years, many parents of children who have a diagnosis of Williams syndrome have told us that they are very worried about their child's social vulnerability. And that worry increases as their son or daughter grows up, gains more independence, and explores more of the social world. Many people might not have heard of Williams syndrome in the audience. It is relatively rare when we compare it to autism, and it results from a small deletion of genetic material on chromosome 7. And it has wide-ranging impacts on all aspects of development, so social, emotional, cognitive, and it is associated with medical complications too. So like all children, every person with Williams syndrome is different, but there are features of the Williams syndrome profile that are common across many individuals who have a diagnosis. And these features of the profile are very relevant when we think about social vulnerability. So people with Williams syndrome are often described as being very warm and engaging and are highly motivated to seek out social contact with others. And this sociability can be very endearing when you meet someone with Williams syndrome, but actually the sociability masks a range of social challenges that can cause quite significant problems for people with Williams syndrome. For example, many people with Williams syndrome show approach behaviours to both familiar and unfamiliar people and have some difficulty inhibiting those social responses. We also see some difficulty in regulating personal space boundaries and a lack of stranger danger awareness. I'm not sure how clear that quote's going to come up, so I'll just read it out. So this is a quote from a parent of someone with Williams syndrome, and it says, "She's not got boundaries. If she was going to talk to someone, she would put her hand on their knee or arm. She would break that personal space." So when you consider these elements of social behaviours combined with the fact Williams syndrome is also associated with mild to moderate intellectual disability and heightened levels of anxiety for a lot of people with Williams syndrome, you can see why social vulnerability is a real concern in this group. And we know from research looking at real life outcomes that many children with Williams syndrome really struggle with some peer relationships, particularly around maintaining their friendships. And we know that there's a high level of social isolation by adulthood. Okay, so I've used Williams syndrome there as an example of the range of person factors which may impact on social vulnerability. But actually you can see that these social, cognitive and mental health factors also are highly relevant when we think about other neurodivergent children beyond Williams syndrome. And actually in some of our recent research, we've been adopting what's called a cross-syndrome approach. And that's just where we include children with different diagnoses within the same research so that we can identify both the commonalities and the differences. And crucially, we're starting with Williams syndrome as sort of a priority in this programme of research, but we recognise that this is an issue that we need to address and understand within a range of neurodivergent children, including autistic children, children with Fragile X syndrome, and ADHD too. And this is all sort of part of the larger projects that we're working on. Okay, so while neurodivergent children are known to be at sort of increased likelihood of experiencing these adverse social outcomes, the factors that predict social vulnerability are less well understood. And in my research, I'm trying to examine the relationship between some person factors and social vulnerability. And I'll just give you an example of the types of factors that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at cognitive skills. So what we would know as IQ, but also more specifically what we call executive functions. So these are higher level thinking skills such as controlling impulses, paying attention, organising, planning, that sort of skill. We're also looking at the dynamics of social interactions. So we're looking at social behaviours when interacting with familiar versus unfamiliar people, when interacting with similar aged peers versus with adults. And then we're also looking at more general factors such as how do social vulnerabilities change as children grow up and go through different life stages. So we've recently conducted an interview study with young adults with Williams syndrome, asking about their friendships over their school years, thinking about the social challenges, what friendship means to them, things like that. And Mary's already touched on anxiety. So we know that mental health challenges frequently co-occur alongside conditions like Williams syndrome. And we're interested to think specifically about anxiety and what sort of role anxiety is playing in this picture. Okay, so I thought I'd just briefly tell you the other questions that I'm interested in. So I've just mentioned that I'm looking at factors and how these contribute to social vulnerability. I'm interested in thinking about, do the pathways to social vulnerability look similar or different in a range of groups? And that's why we adopt that cross-syndrome approach that I told you about. And crucially, we also think about what is the impact of social vulnerability for both the individual and the wider family when we think about family well-being and decisions for the future. And a really important message that I maybe should have said at the very start is that not all neurodivergent children will be socially vulnerable. We know that everyone's different and everyone has different experiences. But crucially, what we want to be able to do is know how to support families who do have concerns about their child's social vulnerability. So that's what I'm sort of working on at the minute, but thinking a bit further in the future, what are the things that we want to understand? I said at the very start that social vulnerability is an interaction between both the environment and these person factors. So crucially, what we need to do to make progress with our understanding in this area is to understand what role do the extrinsic factors play as well as the person factors. So thinking about things like level of autonomy, parental supervision, thinking about social inclusion, social support structures. That's all going to be really important if we're going to get the full picture of what's going on. And finally, what we also want to be able to do is to capture subtle real-life social behaviours in a research setting. And that's really hard to do because in sort of a lab setting, we often lose the very essence of these social behaviours. So we're trying to think of quite clever methods that we can use to look at things like eye contact, everyday eye contact. And I know Reese is going to touch on eye contact, so I won't say anything more about that. But another example would be to look at personal space regulation. How can we capture that? And we're thinking quite creatively about using virtual reality to capture those sorts of behaviours. So I'll stop there and just say thank you for listening. And if you did have any questions, I'd be really happy to hear from you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Ellen. That's fantastic. It's a real illustration there on how we don't study autism in isolation and can think about the broader population approach and also other groups or communities that might have overlapping issues that are really relevant to some of the things that we're studying in autism. Thank you, Ellen. So the second talk we'll go straight on to is Reese Proud, who has started his PhD in this. He's a first year PhD student with us, and Reese is studying eye contact in autism, and this presentation really is an illustration of the importance of the autistic voice in the research that we conduct, and how Reese is really taking step forwards to ensure that the autistic voice is heard in the research that we're conducting in our group. So I'll hand over to you, Reese. You are muted, so if you unmute yourself.
Yep, it's all good.
Okay, over to you.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, so I've just started my PhD, and this is the name of my thesis. So it's looking into the eyes of a friend, evidence from autism. And I've got 3 pictures on the screen now, which it's a bit obscured by the bars, but you can see them anyway. So these are 3 autistic people that I know. So we've got my 2 brothers and one of my close friends. And I guess the first point that I want to make is just the variability in eye contact. So I've spoken to them all quite a lot about eye contact, and I've gotten very different responses. So for example, one of them may say, oh, it's very sort of intimate, it's quite intense for me to make eye contact with other people, particularly strangers or people that I don't know. Whereas another one may say, actually, eye contact, I don't really see it as a problem. I just think that neurotypicals are a bit strange for wanting a lot of eye contact. So we get this very broad range of like how autistic people tend to report eye contact, but I'll come back to that later. Okay, we'll start at the very beginning. So, why is eye contact important? So can I move this? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, why is eye contact important? And we can sort of understand this as it sort of signals a lot of social information. So we have this little boy here who's trying to hide eye contact, which gives us quite a lot of social information. Maybe he's embarrassed, maybe he's trying to hide something, maybe he's done something wrong and doesn't want us to find out. So yeah, avoiding eye contact can in itself be quite informative on its own. We have this girl here who seems to be making too much eye contact, and it becomes quite intimidating. It's almost quite threatening. We have an expression of boredom here made by eye contact. And on the bottom, we have like interest in someone based on their eye contact. So we can get quite a lot of social information from eye contact. So we can see eye contact is quite an important thing. And then if we look at sort of this eye contact or eye gaze in autistic people, we do see a difference. So if you look on the leftmost slide, this was done with teenagers. There's a little face in the house here. I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but on the top we have an autistic person. So they've looked more towards sort of the mountain area, towards these houses, but not so much towards the face. Whereas on the bottom we have a neurotypical person, and they've looked pretty much entirely towards the face. And we see that in young children as well. So this was a study with young children. And on the left, we have an autistic person, and they've looked towards the mouth quite a bit and towards the sort of toys in her hand, whereas the neurotypical child's looked quite a lot towards the face and the upper parts of the face, mainly the eyes. And in adults, we have a very similar thing. So we have like a still from a film here. And on the left, we have a typical developing viewer who's looked sort of towards the eye region. And then we have an autistic person who's looked sort of more towards the sort of mouth and chin region. So this sort of raises the question of what might contribute to these differences. And this has been quite a major topic of the sort of autism literature. And one theory for this is that it's quite sort of intense. So I have these 2 pictures of quite sad children, and I'm sorry. But yeah, so the idea is that when we sort of look at towards the eyes, we sort of share a lot of that emotion. So if we look towards someone's eyes who are quite sad, we feel quite sad. And the idea is that that might just be too intense for a lot of autistic people. And so they don't look towards the eyes to sort of avoid this emotional intensity, I guess. So it's sort of an emotional regulation strategy is just looking less towards the eyes so you don't get aroused by this sort of intensity thing, which I guess coming back to sort of arousal stuff that we talked about earlier as well. But on the flip side, there's also the argument that maybe they're just not as interested. So it's not that they're avoiding it, it's just not as intense at all for relative to neurotypicals. So for example, if we look at this picture on the right, we have a lot of faces here, but also these buildings are quite interesting. So maybe just actually other things are equally as interesting. So the faces just aren't sort of favored as much, I guess. And this might make sense if you sort of struggle to understand what the face cues mean or what the eye contact cues mean. So if you struggle to understand what people are trying to tell you with eye contact, as we sort of talked about earlier, then yeah, maybe you would be less motivated to look towards the face. And I've sort of tried to illustrate this with this picture on the left. So like there's a lot of faces in this picture, but we can't see them. We can't get any information from them. So I guess it would make sense in that context to maybe look towards the eyes and that kind of thing less, because it's less informative than it would be relative to a neurotypical, for example. And so why are these sort of eye gaze and eye contact differences important? So the way we can sort of think of this is that it comes up in quite a lot. So I've taken examples from sort of children, adults, and also just generally across the lifespan. So if we think in sort of children, for example, you can use eye contact to like play together. So if I look towards your eyes, we make eye contact and then look towards the same thing, we can play. And we can use what's called joint attention in the literature. So we can share attention with each other and play together. Or alternatively, I could use eye contact to trick you. I could see that you're looking over there and not making eye contact with me. So maybe I grab the bucket and run away. So you can use it for both ways, I guess. In the adult world, we use it quite a lot for interviews. So we definitely use like the amount of eye contact that people make in the interview is like a judge of confidence, for example. And that has led to some very interesting interventions. For example, I know there is a program in Sheffield which is having interviews sort of where you walk side by side rather than across from a desk, so you don't have to make so much eye contact whilst you're asking the questions, which may be easier for some autistic people. And then on the bottom we have some emotional pictures. So this is the reading the mind in the eyes test, and then basically you're just given pictures of people's eyes and you have to guess what the emotion is. The one on the left, I think, is boredom, and the one on the right, stern, I think. Don't quote me, I'm not very good at these either. But yeah, so the idea is that we can judge the emotions from people's eyes as well. So, but if you don't look towards the eyes, then you might miss these emotions. And this might be quite scary. So, for example, if someone walks up to you when you're sort of sat down somewhere and you can't read their eyes, or you don't understand what their eyes mean, that might be quite threatening. They just want to come and have a friendly chat. But if you can't tell that from the eyes and understand what they mean when they're making the eye contact with you, that could be quite intimidating. And that's definitely something that some of my brothers have reported. And we could sort of stop there. That's, I guess, the sort of whistle-stop tour of how the literature sort of been understood in the past. But it doesn't really touch much on what autistic people actually say and what they report, because a lot of autistic people can report their experiences of eye contact and what they think about eye contact and that kind of thing. And that can be important both theoretically and practically, because in theoretical terms, it's quite useful for autistic people to tell us their experiences. Maybe they experience something, or they can tell us something that actually we as neurotypicals just miss, and we don't see that because we don't live in that life, I guess. We just don't have that experience that they may have. And in practical terms, it can be quite useful to sort of know what strategies have been useful for autistic people, or what autistic people want us to research. So it's very important to have sort of an autistic voice coming into the literature and sort of telling us what their perspectives are, and then that way that can guide us in terms of other research that we do, and also theoretically give us new areas to look at, for example. And so on that sort of note, I have some quotes here from a study which asked autistic people to describe their own eye contact and how it makes them feel. And we have quite a lot of variation. So for this first one, this person said that if I'm forced to make eye contact, my body becomes tense, my skin tingles, and my jawline becomes somewhat numb. So that's quite an intense sort of emotional reaction to being forced to make eye contact. Whereas this second person's just said that they can see that they're using eye contact to communicate with them, but they just can't tell what they're saying. So they can't sort of understand what the eye contact means, even if it may not give that same emotional response. And then on this last one, we have a sort of case where making eye contact may actually be less beneficial for the social interaction itself. So for example, this person said, if I don't make eye contact, I can concentrate on the conversation, but people don't think I'm paying attention to them. So maybe they'll stop talking. But on the other hand, if I do make eye contact, then people will keep talking, but the problem then is that I can't concentrate on what they're saying. So it's this sort of balance of actually having to juggle making eye contact and listening to the sort of conversation, which doesn't come up very much in the current literature, which is why it's very useful to get this sort of autistic perspective, because that's something that's very interesting and very useful. And in the same way, we can have a look at what sort of strategies autistic people report that might make eye contact a little bit easier. So this person said that just practice on someone you feel comfortable with, even a relative. You might not be able to maintain it, and it can be scary at first, but try for a few seconds at a time. And once you can do that, you can practice on other people. So it's this sort of like building yourself up, I guess. So you start with someone that you know well, maybe a relative, a friend, or something like that. And then you sort of practice more and more. Other people have also reported practicing with animals and pets. So making eye contact with your dog before moving on to people, because that's easier, or using pictures, for example. There's lots of other strategies that have been reported as well. So some people report looking toward the sort of middle of the eyes, so like the nose region, because that can make it a little bit easier. Some people report wearing glasses that they don't need technically, but it actually puts the barrier between their eyes and other people, so that makes it feel less intimate, which has been quite useful for them. One of my friends reported a sort of triangle strategy where she memorizes based on her relationship with that person, she has different triangles. So if it's a friend, maybe she has like an eye-based triangle. If it's someone she's romantically interested in, maybe a mouth-based triangle. Or just timing your eye contact. So you can say, okay, I'm going to look at you for 3 seconds and then stop looking at you and then look at you for 3 seconds and that kind of thing. So lots of different strategies have come out that autistic people have found useful. And it can be very useful to involve the autistic community in research because they can tell us these things, what helps them. And then we can help sort of disseminate that to more people. But we can also sort of go one step further than that. And actually, I answered this question at the beginning and I sort of answered it very briefly, but we can look at sort of why is eye contact important through a different lens and say, is eye contact that important? So I've given 3 examples here where we can't see the eyes at all. We couldn't get any eye contact cues whatsoever, but we can still gain quite a lot of information about what's going on here. So this person on the left is pointing at us. They want to bring attention to us. From the mouth, we can tell that they're probably quite angry with us. From this second person, we can see that their mouth is moving. They're using words. So they're trying to communicate with us that way. We can also, maybe there's something in the words. Maybe they're telling us how they feel, which may be a different cue that you can use in a social interaction rather than the eye contact. And then this last one, we have body language. So this person's just shrugging. So we can guess what they may mean from that. Even if we can't see the eyes, we can guess that they're not sure about something. So the idea is that I guess there's more than one way to skin a cat, would be the easiest way of putting it. So there may be different strategies that autistic people can use and may find useful rather than using solely eye contact. I mean, eye contact may be useful for neurotypicals, but there may be another strategy that autistic people can use and that they may find more beneficial or more useful. And there's also a lot of contexts where eye contact cues aren't available. So for example, if you're talking to someone online, if you're talking over the phone, if you're talking to another autistic person. So these sort of eye contact cues become very different. And there seems to be a lot of literature showing that autistic people do feel very different when they're talking to other autistic people, or if they're talking to or talking online, for example. So that could be another way to socially communicate, but without this sort of eye contact demand, I guess. And we can sort of take that even further, I guess, and just pretend for a second that we knew everything there was to know about eye contact in autistic people. But would that actually improve the quality of life of autistic people? And I guess this comes more to the sort of application of the research, which is we've been sort of hinting at all the way through. And I guess this depends on how we use the research, because one way we could do it is to say, okay, we know that there are eye contact differences in autistic people, we should try and make them more typical like. But particularly if forcing you to make eye contact in that way, which you wouldn't naturally do, makes you quite distressed or quite anxious, it might make you look more typical, but actually that may not be particularly good for your quality of life if you're feeling very anxious because you're forced to make eye contact when that wouldn't come naturally to you. Another way we could look at it is actually educating neurotypicals. So we can use these sort of our understanding of these eye contact differences to help neurotypicals to understand autistic people, and therefore we can have just better social interactions overall between neurotypicals and autistic individuals in sort of dyads in that way. And so there's sort of 2 ways we can go about it, and we can sort of say and sort of attempt to educate neurotypicals in that way. And this is sort of the very brief overview of my PhD. I've only just started it, so I don't have very much here. But so the first stage will be interviews with autistic people. And importantly, these interviews are constructed with autistic people in the first place. So they're intentionally very broad, asking lots of questions about social interactions, friendships, about eye contact and their experiences of it, whether they have any strategies that they found useful for eye contact, whether they've had any other strategies which don't include eye contact, but actually help them very much in social situations, or even strategies that other people have used that they found quite useful. So for example, if a neurotypical does something which makes their eye contact easier, that would be quite useful to know. And then in the second and third stage, in the second stage, we can look at the sort of eye tracking. So we can put these sort of interviews into the sort of eye tracking research that's been sort of discussed earlier, and have a look at, so what if, so for example, if eye contact is reported to be easier with friends, do we see that in this sort of eye tracking? So actually, would those pictures that I showed before look very different if actually I knew the person who was on the screen? And then the third one is to encompass heterogeneity. This is going to be particularly important with the eye tracking, because some autistic people do have communication difficulties, so it's quite difficult for them to participate in an interview, and therefore it's quite important to include them when we do the eye tracking and all that kind of thing, so we can try and encompass the broad heterogeneity of autism. And then finally, we can have a look at what predicts these eye gaze differences. So for example, it could be maybe if you are better at reading the eyes in the first place, that would predict you looking towards the eyes more. Or maybe it would be anxiety. So maybe if you're quite an anxious person, that makes eye contact more difficult because it heightens your anxiety in the first place. And so we can look at all the different predictors which may link towards these sort of eye contact differences, and also use these interviews to sort of have a look at what strategies may be useful for autistic people. Okay, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhys. That's fantastic. Thank you, Rhys. So that's our two presentations on the sensory world and autism. We're going to move on in terms of our final theme for this evening. We're going to move to Ellie. So yep, Ellie's there. Excellent. So Ellie is going to talk to us about her research on autistic females, adults and children, and is going to present her research as a second-year PhD student in the group. So thank you, Ellie. Are you okay to share your screen?
Yeah, can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's super. Just put it on slideshow view and we'll be able to see. Super, thank you.
Good, okay. So good evening, everybody. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about the work that I've been doing. So my PhD is really all about improving recognition of autism in females. And this particular study, which is a survey study asking the question, what do teachers know about sex differences in autism? It was inspired by some really interesting studies of late diagnosed autistic women who, one of the themes in those studies was that they cited a lack of knowledge of autism in females amongst teachers is one contributing factor to their late diagnosis. So just in terms of why is sort of, timing of recognition important? Well, we know from the literature that autistic girls specifically without intellectual disability are currently under-recognised. We also know from the literature that an early diagnosis really does matter. It's long been associated with better long-term outcomes. For example, access to resources and support and understanding from people around you as well. The other thing more recently, and this is from studies with late diagnosed autistic women and wider surveys as well, is there's also quite a lot of evidence that late diagnosis has consequences, particularly for mental health. So later diagnosis has been associated with anxiety and depression and sort of identity confusion as well. So talking specifically about autism in females, again, there's quite a snowball of evidence, a sort of building evidence in the literature that there is a strong possibility that autism presents differently in females than it does in males. And again, there are a real combination of reasons for that. One reason may be that particularly in girls, behaviours may appear superficially to be more gender typical, and I'll talk a bit about that a bit later. The other thing, this is more recent in the literature, is that there is this idea that camouflaging one's autistic characteristics or wanting to mask or compensate for them, potentially to avoid bullying, potentially to fit in, and sometimes even unconsciously, may be more common in females, although it has been reported in males as well. And another quite strong theme in the literature, it's been around for a while, is that sort of in the general population, there may be expectations unconsciously geared towards a male version of autism. All right, so expecting that autism will look like how it presents in males, and maybe not being aware of how it may appear in females. So there is a combination of factors that may explain missed, inaccurate and delayed diagnosis of autism in females. So then I started looking in the literature to understand sort of practically how do these delays occur. And I started looking at the diagnostic pathway for girls. You know, what's it like if you're an autistic girl and you want to make your way towards a diagnosis? What does the literature say? Well, the first thing is that for girls who do get a diagnosis, i.e. they're not diagnosed as adults, but diagnosed as children, they are on average diagnosed a whole 2 years later than boys are. And that is despite the timing of the first concern raised by a parent. The other thing that's really interesting is that the delay occurs pre-referral for assessment. All right, so once girls are actually sort of in front of clinicians, that there isn't so much of a delay. It all happens sort of before that referral for assessment. So there are really, this is a tale in two halves really. There is the pre-assessment stage where this is all down to what I'm going to call gatekeepers. So these are people who aren't necessarily autistic professionals or specialists, but they have a big role in to play in terms of getting girls referred. And then there is, once you're actually in front of a clinician having an assessment, there are some factors there, but I'm not going to talk about those this evening. There are some questions over how good the current diagnostic tools are at picking up autism in girls, and that girls seem to need some additional sort of other issues compared with boys to actually get a diagnosis of autism. But where my focus was is really around this idea of gatekeepers. And remember those studies that late diagnosed women, it came up quite a lot around this lack of sort of understanding or knowledge amongst teachers could potentially have contributed to a delay. Now, the literature's got some really interesting studies. There aren't many of them, but the ones that are there are interesting as to why this might be. So one of them was that for girls who do receive a diagnosis compared with boys who receive a diagnosis, it was found that teachers were significantly less likely to have reported concerns than they were for the boys. Another one, there's some interesting parental reports coming from parents as well. So there was a large-scale survey who asked parents of autistic boys and girls about, you know, sort of some of their experiences at school. And the parents of girls reported that their daughters would try really quite hard to blend in at school. All right, so through various sort of strategies like learning, you know, when's it okay to laugh at a joke, or what gestures should they use when they're with their friends? How could they sound like their peers, more like their peers? Whereas interesting in this study, the parents of boys didn't report that. So that sort of lends itself to something along the lines of camouflaging or maybe masking. And the other one as well, this is sort of more less conscious behaviours, is that there are a couple of really interesting studies that show that girls may almost inadvertently, superficially look and sound like non-autistic girls, more so than autistic boys compared with non-autistic boys. So an example would be, there was a playground study where they noticed that non-autistic boys tend to play structured games, like they might play football and they'll organise themselves in a very obvious way, whereas an autistic boy would tend to remain separate from that. So that may be because it's difficult to join in, or they may be literally playing with the ball. It might be more challenging for an autistic boy. But what it meant from a teacher's perspective is that it would be more straightforward, if you like, to identify an autistic boy. Whereas girls, a gender typical behaviour on the playground is girls were found to sort of group together and move about in groups and talk to each other. Whereas an autistic girl may stand in close proximity to her peers, but may not actually be joining in. And so from a teacher's perspective, that may be quite difficult to spot compared with the boys. So that's another area of interest as well. And in terms of sounding, there are some ways that children speak, and there's been some very initial studies showing that autistic girls tend to sound more like non-autistic girls as compared to autistic boys and non-autistic boys. So this is all quite new, this picture. So one thing that I really wanted to understand was that, well, you know, teachers are clearly really important gatekeepers to the diagnostic pathway and sort of maybe getting a girl started on that pathway to referral. So I was curious about how much do teachers know about some of this stuff, sex differences and autism. So my study was a survey study. My aims were to find out what do teachers know about sex differences in autism presentation. And my specific research questions were, first question is, do teachers know that autism presents differently in males and females? And if so, what do they know specifically about that presentation of autism in females? And actually, how confident are they in recognizing undiagnosed autism in, say, a girl compared with undiagnosed autism in a boy? So it was we designed a bespoke online questionnaire. We recruited teachers via various social media channels, and there was a mix of open and closed questions, right? So to get a real variety, sort of really wanted to understand teachers' perspectives. And we really appreciative of all the people who took their time to give some really very comprehensive responses. Actually, we had 90 teachers respond. 83% of those teachers were female, which is broadly in line with the number of teachers in the UK. What was interesting was that on average, teachers were really experienced in terms of years in as a teacher, and they were also SEN and autism aware as well. A lot of the teachers had experience either in SENCO roles or working with autistic children. So we had 77 teachers and 13 teaching assistants, and they were in a mix of mainstream and special educational needs schools as well. So in terms of the results, we had a very rich collection of results. So I'm going to present to you now as sort of some key headlines, really. So from these 90 participants, so the first question was, do teachers know that autism presents differently in males and females? And 73% of teachers said yes, that they did think that autism presents differently across the sexes. What do teachers know about presentation of autism in females? Well, 69% of those teachers cited masking in females as a main reason for sex differences. And interestingly, just over half of teachers believe that boys were more impaired than girls in social communication and interaction. And in terms of confidence, kind of as we expected, really. In terms of our teachers less confident in recognizing autism in girls than in boys, well, yes. So 81% of teachers were fairly confident or very confident in recognizing undiagnosed in autism, compared with only 54% of confidence in recognizing autism in girls. So really interestingly as well, although nearly all of the teachers had had some form of training for working with autistic children in the classroom, 83% reported never having had any training in sex differences in autism specifically. In fact, actually, we asked teachers what they wanted to support them in recognizing autism in girls, and there were lots of responses actually, and just over half of those suggestions related specifically to training and understanding and awareness would really help of autism in girls. So sort of, what does all this suggest? What do these results suggest? Well, one thing that's very clear is that teachers are aware that autism presents differently in girls and boys. But one of the possible interpretations of these results is that the awareness of masking in girls may sort of be conceptual. So it's sort of knowing that that masking happens, but not that the literature suggests that girls masking in girls is actually hiding similar levels of social impairments to boys. All right, so even though girls may appear to be more like their non-autistic peers, actually the research really demonstrates quite clearly that the levels of social impairments between girls and boys are actually very similar underneath that. And our results suggest that that understanding may not quite be there amongst teachers. The other thing as well is that it may be at the moment, it may be that it's quite hard for a teacher to know what masking actually looks like in the classroom, right? So how to actually, so maybe aware that it exists, but not know actually how to spot it in a way. So another possibility is that that the behaviours observed in autistic girls may be being interpreted as differences, or that girls are coping, rather than actually indicating that it's masking underlying difficulties that need referral for assessment in the same way that it would be for an autistic boy. So I think our results suggest, and also certainly the teachers said this themselves in our study, that teachers would benefit very much from training that increases their knowledge and confidence in recognizing autism in girls, and also probably that that the levels of social impairment are actually similar between autistic boys and girls, even if it doesn't look and sound that way. So that was that study. So, but there's still a lot more that we need to know. So this will probably be certainly the rest of my PhD will probably be some of this. So there are implications for both educational and clinical settings. You know, we still very much need to know this idea around sort of underlying or typical sex differences in social behaviours. How do those present in autistic children? And how can you sort of recognise autistic children in the context of underlying sex differences? Also, very, very much needed as a matter of urgency, I believe that, you know, what do masking and or coping behaviours in autistic girls look and sound like? To what extent are these helpful and unhelpful, but very much from the perspective of autistic girls? You know, masking may be really useful if you're an adolescent girl wanting to fit in with your peers, but it may also be unhelpful from some, you know, in some contexts as well. And also, I'm just going to let my dog out, sorry. Sorry about that, he was asleep. And also, really, you know, what underpins the capabilities of autistic girls to look and sound more like non-autistic girls, say, compared with autistic boys? So closely related to that, coming soon to a screen near you, I'm going to be starting a study in the next sort of coming weeks and months, looking at language markers, right? So some of that stuff I referred to earlier on, which is really wanting to understand how and why do autistic girls sound more like non-autistic girls compared with, you know, autistic boys sounding like non-autistic boys. And really this is to try and get the evidence very much to, you know, to support you know, people in gatekeeping roles as well as clinicians, but, you know, to support girls to get recognised in a timely way, because we know that has better long-term outcomes. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That's fantastic. So that's all of our speakers for this evening. I hope that that has given you a really great insight into the types of projects that we are running in Durham and as part of our research program on autism. I will just touch on one fantastic recent question in the Q&A. Thank you for all your questions that have come in this evening. We've tried to answer them as we've gone on in the chat as much as possible, so thank you. And if we haven't got to you, please do feel free to contact us. I will touch on one question because it's particularly timely. So somebody just asked, how has COVID impacted upon your research? I think that every single one of the researchers in this group can agree that COVID has had an absolutely huge, immense impact upon the research that we're conducting. The PhD group that we have here who have presented to you today and across all of the projects have been absolutely wonderful at trying to adapt their research during a global pandemic. And we are hugely proud of what they have done to try and ensure that their research is impacted as little as possible, and that we can continue to do research that we think is really important for not only advancing our theories around autism and the scientific and academic relevance of the work, but also the translation of the research to practice. We have tried to take research online whenever possible. That isn't always possible for the types of projects that we want to run, and for some of the groups that we want to work with, online research really isn't a manageable and feasible endeavour at all. So it has been particularly difficult, and we are keeping going, and we will keep going. And as I say, the resilience in the group has been fantastic, and there is no doubt that we have been impacted, but we are really keen to embrace technology and mitigate some of those impacts and work in different ways and think in novel, innovative ways to go forward and protect our research from the impact of the pandemic, really. So I am aware that it's 10 to 9, and it's really fantastic that so many of you have stayed with us throughout the presentations this evening. It's really great that we are able to talk to such a broad, wide audience. Some of the questions that have come in have been fantastic, and it's great to see so much positivity about the research that's being conducted and the potential impact of that work as well. So a huge thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening, and to all of our presenters as well. We will be trying to ensure that the recording of this session is available in the coming weeks after Easter, and we'll send a link to that around to everybody who had registered for the event as well. Mary, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I did, because we've just had a couple of questions in the chat about email addresses and contacts before we finished for this evening. So what I'll do is I'll just share my last slide from my talk, because it had mine and Debbie's email address on there. It's just for people who wanted to maybe contact us quite soon before the recording was available. So I'll just pop that up for 2 seconds, just to give anybody a chance to write down our email addresses for contact points before the recording will be made available. And just another question about the recording, we will make that available as soon as we can. And I think the link for that will be sent via email, Debbie, is it by the...
Yeah, I'll send that to everybody who's registered via Eventbrite. I will send the link to the recording. We're also hoping to get that onto the university's YouTube channel. That may take slightly longer than just having the available recording, but we'll do whatever we can to get the recording out to people as soon as possible.
So hopefully that's given you a chance to...
I can't see your screen.
Yeah. You can't see my screen?
No.
Oh, wow.
So, can now. There you go.
Okay. Give people a chance to jot down email addresses.
Says Mary's email address there and my email address, and we do have a general Centre for Developmental Disorders email address, which is just cdd@durham.ac.uk as well, which will be picked up more broadly by the team. But thank you to all of our speakers and to everybody who has attended this evening. It's really great to be able to disseminate the work to such a broad audience. So thank you once again for everybody taking your time to join us this evening.